Welcome back to Researching Peace, the podcast presented by the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. My name is Stefan Döring. I'm a researcher here at the department. Today, we're examining the link between science and policy. As scholars at the university, we have many different roles. For example, we're teachers, we conduct research. But beyond that, we're often asked to provide some type of insights to policy and practice. But how exactly can we link research with policy or policy with researchers? That's not always obvious. So to talk about some of these challenges and potentially what we could do better, I've invited a former colleague who transitioned from research to a more policy-oriented role. Florian Krampe is the Director of Studies, Peace and Development at SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, where he also currently serves as the Acting Director of the SIPRI Climate Change and Risk Program. Hi Florian, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. Before we start talking research and policy, can you maybe introduce yourself a little bit more? What's your background? What type of research have you mainly worked on?
Yes, thanks. So I'm Florian Krampe. I'm, as you said, Director of Studies, Peace and Development, and also directing the Climate Change and Risk Program at SIPRI. I've been at SIPRI now for I think 7.5 years. But before that, I did my PhD and master here at the department at Uppsala University. Very much looking at the environmental links to peace building, how we can integrate environmental issues into peace building processes. What do we know about that? And with sort of the idea of how can environmental cooperation and environmental efforts in post-conflict settings support peace processes?
Research might sometimes be just sort of driven by, what are pure academic debates and research gaps, whereas I understand maybe your work is probably more, what are like needs by stakeholders, by policymakers. Is that a correct statement?
Yes and no. I mean, we're doing both, right? Our work is closely linked to policy. I mean, our catchphrase, I guess, in that would be, we're based in science but leaning towards policy, right? Mm-hmm. So we have a strong focus on ensuring quality and academic rigor in the work, but we're asking primarily questions that are of significant policy relevance. Some of them come from the policy side to us, but also others are that we identify are key issues policymakers should pay attention to. Maybe to give you an example from the work in climate change and security, one thing we see over the last 5 years maybe is a significant uptake of climate change issues within UN special political missions or peacekeeping operations, sort of a recognition of that. There are climate security advisors deployed in those missions. Missions are working on that. Missions are recognizing those are issues that are influencing the work. Now, if you compare that to the research and the academic research specifically that is out there, we wrote a piece in International Affairs about that earlier last year, there's barely anything, right? So sometimes the policy reality of life in those situations and programming and things like that is way ahead of where the research is. Sometimes the research is way ahead of where the policy debate is. Were there any challenges, like when you mainly have done research but then moved on to also doing more policy-oriented outputs? Yeah, I think, it's a really interesting and important question because quite frankly, when I started it, I didn't want to do it. I was like, no, policy, that's kind of strange. I'm trained as an academic, right? You finished your PhD, this is the work you did, and obviously peace and conflict research is policy relevant by design and relevant to society. But I was sort of afraid of that step to policy, right? What did I know? It's actually quite interesting. It's quite rewarding. It's really interesting to have that close relationship and have the impact on policy. But I think that is sort of also the important thing that I've learned is my advice to a policymaker is only as good as the research is. And if we do bad research, I'm not giving good advice. And
I mean, I think it's also really good to sort of think about it. I mean, our institution, for example, like many others, where the programs we have at not just at the PhD but also at undergraduate levels is like often geared towards academic excellence, and like we teach a lot about research and things like that. But the truth is that a lot of our students will not go on to do research, right? They will go on into other roles. They might work for government actors or non-state actors. So I think it's in that sense it's also really good to have this in mind. But would you say then, given like your background as a researcher, have you been in situations where you felt like, oh, this is really useful because I have done this before?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean going back to the earlier point around what students, for instance, here at the department are trained for, I think that is absolutely fundamental, because you get the tools to apply. You might need to adjust some of those tools later, like a question of case selection is relatively irrelevant if you get a project that tells you to look at, integrated water resource management in Somalia. Then you're like, I'm going to look at that. But that doesn't mean that you can't do substantive, rigorous research on that, right? And having those tools and focusing on that and applying those is I think the fundamental basis that also the department's work gives. I think what is different is how do you translate that, all of that, into something a policymaker understands and can not just understands. I mean, they're obviously not dumb, but how to make it useful to them. And I think there's sort of a part of understanding, having interactions with policymakers, understanding what is actually important. Some of our work that we've been doing now for quite a couple of years went through also quite some iterations where we ourselves learned how do we make sure this actually works and resonates, and what are the lessons, what are others doing, what of that works, what doesn't work. And the product we're having now is a academically rigorously produced 4-page fact sheet on climate, peace and security risks related to one country. And that is informing UN Security Council debates, right? Now, the challenge is to capture an academic debate about one country in 4 pages. And I think that is our skill. But a part of that is this learning process, but it's also the interaction and the understanding of the other side, like right, understanding the audience that you're talking to. It's not an academic paper. It's a tool, right, that we are providing.
If you put yourself in my shoe, or like in a researcher's shoe, like what do you think we could do better to have a better exchange with policy?
Sometimes I think both sides are a bit afraid, right? The academic side is afraid of policy, and the policy side is afraid of academia. And I think that is a mistake. Again, there are different roles. We should acknowledge that. So not everybody should do everything. But what we see on the policy side is a need for knowledge, a thirst for knowledge of improving responses. So in Somalia, we were working for now a couple of years very closely with the IOM, the International Organization on Migration, and they're implementing different projects in Somalia. So that is their job. They're a humanitarian agency. They are focused on addressing certain issues. But so they want to do that in a way that is peace positive. Now, our role in that is to monitor and support them and do an assessment, like, is this actually peace promoting? And I think that is really important. That is a really important function, but it requires a rethinking on roles. On the policy side, often there's a reluctance to talk about failure, right? Especially on the programming side, because your donors probably don't want to hear that infrastructure program didn't work in the way it was intended. And on the academic side is a fear of being too close to policy and not being independent anymore. And I think those are correct fears, but I think we can overcome them with a different approach. And if you look at the literature on adaptive peace building and iterative peace building, a lot of that Cedric de Koning has been doing, there's a push towards that. And I think we need to, not all, but we need to have more projects that are bringing those things together. In the work with IOM, for us, that means we are in a very privileged position that we are part of the project team. That means we're sitting in meetings, we are part of it. But how do I make sure that the person sitting in those meetings as a researcher is still independent, right? And isn't just like, so how do we combine those things, and how do we make sure that the project implementer also wants to have that, right? And wants to have the lessons about that. And I think that depends still on some of the donors or implementers. But I think there's an increasing appetite also for like, don't tell us in 18 months what went wrong, but if you see something is going wrong, and from our research experience that we see is going wrong, please tell us, right? At the same time, what we do is sort of have an internal red team in-house that we like sort of have a group of people that are not involved in the project that are engaging with those doing the research, right? So just like have sort of that review element of and ensuring that independence. So I think there are ways in figuring it out, but I think this co-creation of knowledge and this working together towards a common goal, I think is really important and a really great opportunity to do rigorous research, show what works and what doesn't work, and thereby have a much more substantive impact, especially in a time when resources are getting increasingly scarce.
Sometimes researchers can also be disappointed by what's happening because, there are some things where we have very clear, very good empirical evidence, and then but nothing is being done because it's at the end it becomes political because, somebody decides something is the right way to go, not because, we have evidence for it, but that's just what the political agenda looks like, right?
Again, this interaction with the policy side is important to understand their problems also, because they're responsible to constituencies. You have a policymakers in country X who is like, well, that sounds great. Here's 5 reasons why that doesn't work, right? And having that reality check is important for us, because I can come up in Stockholm with a lot of fluffy, brilliant ideas that make no sense whatsoever in the reality on the ground. And getting this reality check, I think, is important.
Yes, I think those are really good points. Something else I wanted to discuss was, so we both have worked with peace and water issues, and water research is one of the most diverse fields because you have scholars from law, engineering, different social science disciplines, health, right? This can also be very challenging, right? Because you all come from different backgrounds. You look at things in a very different way. Is that something you've come across as well?
What is the problem is if we all stay in our silos, right? And I think enabling and enhancing the communication across those silos is really important, especially in the context that we are interested in, which are fragile, conflict affected. There are no easy solutions, right? They are already complex and complicated in itself just by the fragility and the conflicts that are going on. So on top of that, you're adding climate and water challenges, which again make everything more complicated because, well, probably you're not going to have a peacekeeper who is going to build an irrigation channel, things like that. So you need the engineers, you need the development people. So you need a lot of coordination, and you need to bring people together and enable that communication that leads to better outcomes. Because at the end of the day, especially in the context that we are interested in and working in, a lot of time it's about governance and politics. And then the engineering solution, the most effective engineering solution, is not the right solution for the context. Right? And in that sense, understanding the political realities of a conflict and then working with an engineer to figuring out how we come to the best possible outcome, I think it's a challenge, but it's also absolutely fascinating and enriching.
Yeah, maybe in that sense I can also see a lot of potential now, but I think like a lot of science goes more and more into this, to the interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary projects, where because, as you said, a lot of the issues we understand now, like you can't just come with an engineering mindset to solve something that's, at the bottom of it, a social problem, right? But also you can't come in and try to solve like some political issue without knowing the facts on public health, on I don't know, geosciences, things like that. And maybe that's like, now as science goes more and more towards that, that's probably creates also better opportunities for policy exchanges.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that we learn from peace building and everything, right? It's like there's no equal solutions, or there's no cookie cutter approach that you apply the same thing in every case. And I think that makes it, again, fascinating, creative, and bringing interaction with a lot of different sectors that need to work together to come to better responses.
Do you have any good examples of where research and policy really goes together? Is there something you could mention?
The moments where you have this cooperation and you have smart people around the table thinking together about the problem and putting the problem in the center, it's sort of the Jannes liaison approach, right? And I think it's really important. It's like putting the problem in the center, and then sitting around the table and trying to solve it. I think that is what we need, and I think there are a lot of cases where we see positive examples of that. Not on the research policy interface, but just to give you one example of the UN Climate Security Mechanism. It's an agency, or it's a mechanism established in 2018 that brings together the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs in the UN, the UN Development Program, and the UN Environment Program, and by now also the Department of Peace Operations. And so those are UN agencies that work all in these affected areas that haven't really, they are all affected by climate change, and that affects their work. But they're also not necessarily working together, right? Because they have different mandates, different approaches, they have different agencies, different funding streams. So that effort of bringing those agencies together to work together, to talk together about the issue, climate security, is such a great success story and so impactful on the way towards better responses in this field. And then you have research that is both from within the UN, but also from outside, like ours, but also other institutions that are working on this, that is again informing this. I think that's a really great example of seeing this strong interaction and also the space where research can contribute.
Florian, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I think it's been great having you on the podcast. This has been Researching Peace. If you want to hear more about my research, please check out episode 27, where we talk about water and peace a little bit more in detail. I also want to note that this episode was supported by the Geneva Water Hub. For those who are interested, I will provide a link to the Geneva Water Hub, as their work is very much situated at the interface of science and policy. Thank you so much for listening.